School, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's panel about immigration issues in the new presidency. When Professor Abhinan Cover suggested just 2 weeks ago that we should put something like this together, a lot of people thought, wow, that's not a lot of time to put together and advertise a major panel. But I thought, this is terrific. This is exactly what the law school should be doing, taking advantage of a major issue when it's hot and allowing people to have a very informed discussion with experts and a Q&A with the audience. And so I'm very excited that Professor Cover was able to pull this off, and we were able to throw this together. On a personal note, and he begged me not to mention this, but I can't help it, really good news for Professor Cover. Just last week, the faculty voted for his tenure. So, conferences like this. You know, there's a lot of students here from the Middle East and other countries that are very worried about what the change in administration is going to mean to their status. And quite frankly, we're concerned about what it's going to mean for our ability to continue to recruit such great students from foreign countries. So I am as eager as anybody to hear from the experts on this. And without further ado, I will turn this over to Professor Cover.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm wearing my Institute for Global Security Law and Policy hat this afternoon and evening. In just the past month, the Institute's been able to put on a couple of highly relevant panels. Immediately the day after the election, we gathered many faculty here to talk about the consequences of that election and what it means, what it portends. And coming out of that, we certainly saw particular interest in issues of immigration. And so that, of course, is the focus of today's panel. Just last week, we also sponsored an event focusing on the issues of mass incarceration as well, and we will continue to bring events to you, to the community, bringing law school expertise and those of the community together on important issues. You know, in what might almost now be characterized as Donald Trump's Gettysburg Address of sorts, in terms of memorable remarks, he said almost 18 months ago when he announced his candidacy the following words, some of which you could probably know by heart. When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're not sending you. They're not sending you. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people. But I speak to border guards, and they tell us what we're getting, and it only makes common sense. It only makes common sense. They're sending us not the right people. It's coming from more than Mexico. It's coming from all over South and Latin America, and it's coming probably from the Middle East, but we don't know. Because we have no protection, and we have no competence, we don't know what's happening. And it's got to stop, and it's got to stop fast. And he went on to say that he will immediately terminate President Obama's illegal executive order on immigration immediately. That is presumably referring to the Deferred Action for childhood arrivals. So these were his opening remarks, and to some degree, the campaign certainly, he remained fairly consistent on those remarks. You can look at his 10-point plan on his website today, and he remains fairly steadfast in those views. We have with us a terrific panel, and moderating will be my colleague, Andy Bramante, who is an associate with the immigration law firm Rosner, Partners, and also an adjunct professor here leading the immigration clinic component within our Kramer Law Clinic Center. So I'm going to turn it over to Professor Bramante and our wonderful panel. Please join me in welcoming them all.
Thank you for coming today. I know all of us up here, like perhaps many of you, are barraged with questions like, what's going to happen? What am I supposed to do? I'm not sure that we're going to be able to give you any definitive answers today. Hopefully we'll provide you a framework to understand what the realm of possibilities are, maybe make some predictions, and then hopefully ask what we can do individually and collectively. I think we're very privileged to have several people today that are just amazing in this field. Dave Leopold has been a hero of mine for 8-10 years since I've known him. Lynn Tramonte, the same. She's helped co-direct a national group called America's Voice, which has just done about 2 to 3 years of amazing work promoting immigrant rights and immigrant advocacy during the past election, and an esteemed immigration attorney in the area, Lama Alwan Northcutt, who I met yesterday and realized that she should have been a hero of mine for the last 15 years or so, because she's really amazing. So I'm going to let them hopefully address a number of questions. Our goal is to keep our remarks to about 30 minutes to make sure that you have plenty of time to ask questions, because this topic that we're dealing with today, this could be an all-day colloquium, and we're going to try to do this in about 55 minutes. What we thought we would start off with is addressing the issue of what kind of statutory changes might happen versus what kind of executive changes might happen. We all know that President Obama was unsuccessful during his presidency, and particularly in 2012, getting comprehensive immigration reform passed through the House of Representatives. But he did make several substantive changes by executive order or by agency regulation. Some of the most well-known examples that have benefited millions of people are DACA for young people, the Provisional Waiver Program, a new enforcement priority scheme that was put in place about 2 years ago that protected immigrants that do not have a criminal record and have been here for a long time. For students, we've extended STEM OPT to a full 2-year period and provided work authorization for H-4 spouses and dozens of other things. So I think the question that we want to first address is whether or not President-elect Trump can reverse those good things without Congress passing any laws, and if so, how quickly can he eliminate them, and is he likely to do so? And so I think Dave Leopold, who is past president of the American Immigration Lawyers Association and a frequent expert, frequent speaker on this kind of topics, will have the first crack at that question.
Thanks, Andy, and thanks for everybody for coming by. I do think that we will walk out of here, though, with some concrete to-do lists. Number one on top of the to-do list will be to go home and organize, because that's how we're going to keep justice in our system. But let me talk to the specific question: what can Donald Trump do? It's important to give some background as to what the immigration enforcement scheme looks like right now. Andy mentioned that President Obama set forth enforcement priorities. In 2014, he reordered the enforcement priorities through a memorandum issued by Secretary of Homeland Security, Jay Johnson. And these priorities are mandated by the Homeland Security Act, which provides explicitly that the president shall set enforcement priorities in immigration, civil enforcement priorities. And loosely stated, there's 3 priorities. 1, serious criminals, national security risks, and recent border crossers. 2 are recidivist misdemeanors and serious recidivist misdemeanors, people who have convicted of significant misdemeanors, such as defined as domestic violence, also DUI. And the 3rd level are people who are under recent orders of deportation. We did and we can dispute some of the intricacies of those priorities, but the bottom line is the priorities as they're set right now are focused on removing criminals and national security risks. We have 11 million people in this country estimated who are undocumented. Congress appropriates every year enough money to remove about 400,000 people. That's a small fraction. Well, it's not a small fraction, but it's a fraction of the undocumented population. So I think there's a very strong argument to be made that Congress, in its wisdom, has pretty much told the president we are not going to remove most of the people, because most of these people have been here for years and years. Most of these people have strong family ties. Most of these people are not criminals. I think the criminal element is roughly 13%. I may be a little off on that stat, but not too much. Most of these folks are just people who came here, like the rest of us, our foreparents, for a better life. So We're talking about 18% of the population. So that's the enforcement scheme right now. So in the last 2 years, I think it's fair to say that if you're undocumented and you've been here since before 2014 and you do not have a criminal conviction of any significance, you are not going to be deported. You don't get work authorization necessarily, but you are not going to be deported. So the enforcement scheme has changed quite a bit in the last several years, and it was after a lot of work by a lot of people, namely Dreamers, the organized young people who are undocumented, and they forced the president. The president, as you may know, President Obama was known as the deporter-in-chief, and that changed. That changed his policy, people organizing. So that's the enforcement scheme. So what can he do? Well, the president also issued executive actions, guidance, basically for what we call deferred action. Essentially what the president said was, back in 2012, we are going to invite certain people who are undocumented to come in and apply for a brief reprieve, 2-year reprieve from removal, deportation, and the ability to apply for work authorization if they can show economic need. That's called DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. That's been implemented. Nearly 1 million people, roughly 800,000 dreamers, young people between roughly the ages of 16 and 30, 31, applied, are now working, buying houses, are in the workforce, adding to the economy. And there are economic numbers that are pretty amazing, showing what the contributions are there. There was also DAPA, the Deferred Action for the Parents, which was caught up in litigation, and finally the Supreme Court split on that, and it's pretty much dead. So what can the president do on the first day? Well, he can go into office, and the most controversial thing, I think, at the moment, the most high-profile thing, is what will he do to DACA, which affects 800,000 people. Is he going to walk in there, sign an order, and throw them out of work and back into the shadows? Or is he going to let it expire on its own? There are a couple of permutations of what he can do. Can he do it? Yeah, he can do it. This is guidance. It's not even an executive order. It's guidance. It's memoranda. It's agency guidance. And those of you who understand a little bit about administrative law know that that can be changed, and he can change that on day one. So yes, on day one, he can end that program. He would have to be explicit in the way that he ends the work authorization. It would be complicated, but unfortunately it could be done. Will he do it? That's the big question. And there are efforts around the country, efforts in Congress, efforts on the Hill, to try to persuade Donald Trump that it's not in his best interest, it's not in the country's best interest to do that. On the enforcement priorities, can he come into office and reorder those priorities? Well, we heard that the first thing he did when he ran for president was accuse Mexicans of all being rapists. He has made horrible remarks about Muslim Americans. He has disparaged women. I don't need to go into the litany of it, it'd take too long. So yeah, I mean, he could reorder those priorities. What he has said he will do, at least the most recent interview in 60 Minutes, was that he's going to go after 2 to 3 million criminal aliens, he calls them. The problem with that is there are not 2 to 3 million criminal non-citizens in this country. There just aren't. The Migration Policy Institute, very respected, nonpartisan, estimates that number is at most 690,000. So if he's serious about going after 2 to 3 million, then what he's really saying is he's going to reorder the immigration enforcement priorities and put families back at the top. He can do that. I'll get into some of the other specifics. I want to give others a chance to talk. But the bottom line takeaway is that, yes, the president has enormous discretionary power when it comes to immigration enforcement. Donald Trump can walk into office on day one and wreak havoc on the immigration enforcement scheme.
Lynn, you want to take a shot at that?
I just want to add for some perspective about how an administration can change things. At the end of the Bush administration, the landscape on enforcement for an individual was completely different than it is at the end of the Obama administration. An immigrant that had any contact with law enforcement was going to be reported to ICE. We had the Border Patrol, because Ohio's a border state, And there's 2 Border Patrol stations in Sandusky, near Sandusky, and in Erie, Pennsylvania, that service our area. We had the Border Patrol coming into the interior, looking for, to assist police to take away immigrants. So David and I worked on a case in 2007 of a woman who was nursing, and she was, I think it was a home raid by ICE, and she was taken in. And the best we could do at that point was just to get her to be released from detention so she could continue to breastfeed her baby before she was deported, but she was still deported, and she was not a criminal. So with Obama, after 6 really tough years of him telling us that he had fixed the priorities and that he was going after bad guys, and us telling him, no, you haven't. This is an example. Here's one example. There's a lot of good people that are still being deported. 1.5 million people lives later, they did reorder the priorities. And now you do have a situation where ICE is using prosecutorial discretion in a humane way. And David and I have been doing a lot of forums with members of the undocumented immigrant community to talk about what their rights are, just under the Constitution. And it's really hard to face those rooms, because we don't know what it's going to be like. We have ideas of how it could be Bush on steroids, but we don't really know. And I know a lot of people who voted for Trump say, well, he's not going to be able to do everything that he said he wants to do. That's cold comfort, because if he just does a fraction of what he says he's going to do, it already has terrorized people. And the other part of what he's done, I think, already, not even being in office, is just changed the climate, brought sort of radicalism and extremism and racism up to be something acceptable that you can vocalize now. And you guys have seen that in just the bullying incidents and the swastikas painted on barns and these things that have happened all throughout the country just since he started talking about the immigration issue, and then since he was elected, it's gotten worse. So I am very worried about the transition to this new administration. I'm hopeful, I'm an optimist, I'm hopeful that it won't be as bad as our worst doomsday scenario, but right now we really don't know, and it's very troubling.
I think also you have to look at who he's appointing. And he is appointing Jeff Sessions to the Attorney General position, which has that position does have enormous power over immigration enforcement, because it oversees the Board of Immigration Appeals, the administrative tribunal, and it can issue precedent decisions. He personally, Jeff Sessions, could overrule decisions that protect women, for example. There's a famous decision out of California which protects a woman who was brutally abused, gives her asylum, and he could, with the stroke of a pen, overturn that case. So it's. We will in a second. We will. The other thing is, and I'll be quiet. The other thing is that Steve Bannon, who's a white nationalist, is going to be feet away. So these types of extremists are being normalized.
I'm going to just piggyback on a lot of the points that they made in terms of it's such an unknown. I mean, we know what he said, and one of the things David's always said is you got to take someone at their word, and if their word is, I'm going to come in and deport 2 to 3 million, and we've got this many that are criminals, that's what frightens me more, is that the facts have been not facts. And even ICE, he could have, with a keystroke, found out how many criminal aliens actually exist. David alluded to that. But he could have also gone straight to the source instead of focusing on crazy fake news, and go right to ICE and look at the numbers and see how it jives with what his policies that he's promoting on that 60 Minutes interview that David mentioned. Just to give you an idea, there were 63,500 roughly removals noted by ICE in the past year, and those were the ones that were present in the United States and they were convicted of a crime. So the ones that they actually removed were 63,500. David mentioned the number of, 680,000 that are criminal aliens amongst amongst 11 million undocumented. But when you look at it, the enforcement priorities that we have, I think they fall even in lesser numbers than that number that was quoted. So the 13% of the amount does not come up to 1 or 2 million that he was talking about. And is that because he wants to look like the big guy throwing out as many people as possible to his base? Or is it because he doesn't have the right facts? And that's when I take a breath and say, he'll get the right facts until I see who he is appointing to his cabinet sessions, or having the his ear firmly close to the whispers and not so much whispers of someone like Mr. Bannon, and Chris Kobach, right? Chris Kobach comes out and he says he wants to change the way that we even pursue criminal aliens, redefine it. And that means that we don't even need a conviction, we can start removal with arrests. He has the most strict interpretations of what he believes deportation should mean. So in other words, he's trying to say that we need to deport even more people and make them more deportable by expanding what criminal means. And that is where we're aghast, and that is where we're not finding that comfort, and the right way to call it is cold comfort. I don't know if everybody remembers this, but after 9/11, there was this special call-in registration that had happened. I don't know if you remember it or you heard of it. Not very relevant right now, but boy, is it relevant right now. And I don't know how else to focus on that, because it was called a special registration. It encompassed 100 countries. It was cleverly done to not focus on faith and not focus on ethnicity, but rather nationality or citizenship. So if you were a citizen or a national of these 100 countries, which, by the way, all of which were primarily Muslim countries, you would have to, if you were a male over the age of 16, present in the United States, you did not have your permanent residency, you weren't a refugee, you didn't apply for asylum, you had to go in person to your local office, immigration office, and report and present yourself. You have to show if you're here legally or not, and it was in direct response to what happened in 2000 and to 9/11. It was an attempt to see if we can, out of this, grab all our terrorists. This is how we're going to do it. We're going to focus on these men from these countries. Just remember that concept, because NSEERS has not gone away. Now, in 2011, DHS came out and said, we're going to stop this reporting that we have of these 100 nationals and citizens from these countries. We're going to stop it. But what they did not do is completely remove it. So how would a Trump administration be able to proactively institute this Muslim registry that everybody heard about? I'm going to monitor the Muslims, we're going to follow them, blah, 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 blah. I think NSEERS would be a perfect way for them to do it. And because NSEERS, the framework and the law of it still exists, even though the actual processing of it doesn't, except when you're coming in and out of the airports, that's a different matter. But on U.S. soil, they can reinstitute NSEERS. And they can do it in a way that achieves their goal of monitoring Muslims. And I'll tell you a really funny story. And this is what also is alarming, because I'm really all about facts. When I used to register people for NSEERS, I went with, I'm originally from Lebanon. I was born in Beirut. I'm a Maronite Catholic. When I went with this group of Maronite Catholic Lebanese guys, the officer looked at me and he said, hey, I just got this weird question. I was like, go ahead. Do they wear bikinis in Lebanon? And I was like, my God, that's a great question, because, you know, I think Lebanon actually invented the bikini. He didn't know that, he didn't even realize that even though the people that I had went with were wearing big, gaudy crosses, he didn't even realize that there was a community, Christian community, and I'm sure he doesn't realize that only the president can be a Maronite Catholic in Lebanon. But what bothers me about that, and it'll always stick with me, is that nobody really knows what they're talking about, and yet they're enforcing these policies. I'm not going to say nobody, I know that's a generalization, but an officer that was in charge with the duty of executing this NSEERS, this federal regulation NSEERS, should have been able to decipher who he's dealing with and why he's doing it. He's supposed to be rooting out a potential terrorist. He's supposed to be protecting national security interests. Instead, he clearly showed me that he has no concept of the demographics in the Middle East. I mean, I wonder, I would like to ask some of them if they know the difference between a Shiite Muslim and a Sunni Muslim. I wonder if they know about the minority groups that exist in the Middle East. But putting all that aside and going way above the scope of this, is what David said is very important. People who do possess knowledge need to organize. People have to combat this fake news stuff. They have to combat the fake facts. If you stick with the facts, if you even look at what DHS and ICE is saying, they're doing what Trump thinks he's going to do. They're already doing it. The enforcement priorities are already there. And you know what? We tend to agree with those enforcement priorities. None of us on this panel want criminals that can potentially kill us. Nobody wants a terrorist in this country. I think we can all agree on that point. And there is something called smart, make sense policy. But if you're going to befriend and invite in the Oval Office the king of conspiracy theories, making up facts, then we are going to potentially have a bigger problem than even what Bush instituted.
There's a very practical reason for that, politics aside. So, the argument being, well, they're undocumented, they should be thrown out of the country. Okay, that's the argument. And people have the right to believe that. But let's think about safety. So if you have a finite amount for enforcement, immigration enforcement, where are you going to spend it? Are you going to spend it? It's like a police officer. Police officer sees somebody robbing a bank and somebody trespassing. Who's that police officer going to arrest first? Who would you want that police officer to arrest first? Right? So in immigration, if Trump throws out the priorities and says, you know what, arrest who you can, deport who you can, I want to get rid of everybody, what are they going to do? They're going to go out to the law-abiding undocumented people, the people who will not say when an officer comes at 3 in the morning, do you have a warrant? Because they're not educated in the warrant requirement. They're going to open the door, they're going to invite them in, they're going to get arrested. They're what I used to refer to in the old days as the low-hanging fruit, not to compare people to fruit, but that was the best analogy because it was easy mark. And when the officer's performance metric is based on the numbers of deportations, why would you risk your safety and go after somebody who might harm you if you're going to get the same metric than if you go after somebody who may have a gun and is a convicted felon and drug dealer or whatever? So it makes us safer to have priorities that are followed by Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Their job is to make us safer. And making us safer means focusing on the people who would do us harm. That's why, even though, look, I argued with President Obama, Lynn and I, we got called on the carpet and so on, like many other advocates. I disagreed with the specifics, the way he was, many times the way he was enforcing those priorities. But the bottom line was, overall, it's smart enforcement, like Lama just pointed out. And, if you're going to just go after haphazard, then the people who, if it's a finite amount, the people who really are going to do us harm are more likely to slip through the cracks and do us harm.
As an entree into the question, what can we do? What are some actions? I also want to put an exclamation point on that and point out the importance of the relationship between immigration enforcement and local policing. It's been in the press a lot in the last couple of weeks, major police organizations coming out and saying, we don't want to be in the immigration enforcement business. And the reason is very clear. They understand that the way that you keep safe communities, whether it's Lorain, Cleveland, or Houston, is to maintain very good relations with the people in the community so the people feel safe, they call on you when they need help, they provide information, they have a stake in the safety of their communities. And if you have a situation where local police are actually proactively violating the law, as it would be in Ohio, by picking up people on immigration violations and turning them over to ICE, then it makes the local police the bad guy, the boogeyman, and they lose all cooperation. Let me then ask the question, what can state government, local government, schools like CASE, social service agencies, what can we all do so that 6 months from now or a year from now, we look back and say, you know, it was bad, it was a direction change, but the damage was contained, as opposed to it was an unmitigated disaster and our country will never be the same. What can we do?
Okay, I have some things that you guys can do, and then we'll go to sort of broader institutions. So first of all, Jeff Sessions' nomination is not going to be a cakewalk, and you can call our senators, both Republican and Democrat, and tell them that he should not be confirmed. He has no business being the top civil rights officer of this country. So we need you to call the Senate offices and tell them that you're opposed to his confirmation. If you believe in civil rights, then you define it the way we do. So that's one thing you can do. Another thing you can do if you're already, if you're lawyers, is we need more people to bring racial profiling cases where police are profiling people based on their immigration status. For example, a woman that we know the other day was driving. She was pulled over for because something was hanging off of her car. She didn't have a license. So the next question from the officer was, "Are you here legally?" Because she had brown skin, she spoke with an accent, and English was obviously not her first language. My mom has driven, I don't know how many years or months without a license. She never remembers to renew it. Do you think she's ever been asked if she was here legally? Absolutely not. So we need more eyes and ears, and we need more litigation brought to protect against racial profiling, and that is one clear way to get the police to realize that they need to stick to their job of public safety and let immigration, handle figuring out who's here legally or not. And then a couple other policy ideas that we're all pushing for. Now that we don't trust the federal government is going to have the immigrants' best interests at heart, we need to build a wall of insulation around immigrants so that they don't come into contact with federal enforcement unless they are, dangerous or bad people. And one way we do that, we basically reduce the chances that they can get caught up into the deportation machinery. One thing that would be really helpful for people is to just have a simple ID. There are counties and cities that are creating municipal IDs as just an identification document. There are no benefits that accrue with it, but it's just a way for people to identify themselves to the police. The police can say, okay, yes, you live here, you pay taxes, okay, great, I'm not going to worry about you. And then the holy grail, of course, would be driver's licenses. Immigrants who are here with or without papers should be able to get driver's licenses, which means they get training, they have insurance, they know the rules of the road. It doesn't mean that they have a work permit or immigration status or they can't travel on it. There's nothing like that. It's simply a license to drive, which is supposed to be the intention, way back when they created driving licenses. But it would, again, protect from good people being referred to federal immigration agents who are hungry to meet some quotas.
I know you hear a lot about sanctuary cities and that sort of thing that's been in the news a lot. And since we're in a law school, I thought I'd point out that there really is, the term is meaningless legally. There's no legal definition of a sanctuary city. Really what's going on is the degree to which the local law enforcement turn over information, like Lynn was pointing out, to Immigration and Customs Enforcement. In Ohio, for example, like Lynn pointed out, there is no duty, no legal duty for local law enforcement, whether it's local, county, state, to collaborate with Immigration and Customs Enforcement. That requirement is on a criminal level. If they see crime being committed, that's a different story. But on civil immigration enforcement, and there's a reason for that. And the reason is that immigration enforcement is complex. A woman could be in this country without documents. She could be out here without documents, without any basis. She could not have been lawfully admitted to this country. And the fact that local immigration. So she's living in some community. She gets beaten up by whoever's living in the house and calls the police. The fact that she is undocumented doesn't mean she did anything illegal. It doesn't mean that her presence in the United States is nefarious. And the reason for that is immigration law is extremely complicated. This woman could be entitled to asylum. She could be entitled to a U visa for having been the victim of a crime. She could be entitled to a T visa for having been the victim of trafficking. So there's all kinds of reasons why this woman might actually be here legally and entitled to benefits and entitled to protection under our law. A local police officer has plenty to do. He or she doesn't need to master the immigration statute. That is the job of Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And most local, I think, police chiefs are against collaboration. And the reason is it destroys community trust. When you have a local crime being committed, people are not going to call. They're being more reluctant to call, more reluctant to be witnesses, to come forward if they think that they're going to be separated from their families. There's all kinds of good policy reasons why you wouldn't want to have the locals involved in immigration enforcement.
I would actually go a step further. I would say that for local law enforcement in the United States, following a traffic stop or following an interview of a witness at a crime scene, to hold somebody for even 10 or 15 minutes for ICE to arrive, I would suggest that that is actually illegal action under the Ohio Constitution and the Fourth Amendment. I've litigated that with some success, and in fact, Avi and I first met each other working with several of the cities in northern Ohio, communicating that to their law directors and having them actually change their policies so they would actually stop doing that kind of immigration enforcement of what are basically civil violations where there's no probable cause for a criminal violation. Lama, what any ideas you have on some of the things that we can do individually, collectively?
Well, the ACLU is very active and always doing these know your rights kinds of things, and it's hard to get the word out, like David said. It's difficult for someone who doesn't speak the language, may not even understand their own constitutional rights, that if ICE comes knocking on your door, as they have in many of our clients, and even looking for someone else, doesn't have a warrant, you don't need to let them in. So how do you get the word out? Well, a lot of schools have different organizations. The organizations, I believe, should be reaching out. All the Hispanic student organizations, any organization that exists on a campus should be reaching out to the local, their ties to the local community, and have info sessions on Know Your Rights. I think that would be really, really good. I did want to say something, and it's not exactly touching on this, but in addition to how almost impossible it would be to remove 11 million, I'm going to finish up really quick. 11 million is the amount of revenue that would be lost if DACA recipients, for example, who work, would be stifling. It would be in the billions, I believe, because they work and they pay taxes. Imagine all of that revenue, poof, gone. That is a very cold, hard fact that everybody has to take into consideration.
We could, each one of us, as you can tell, has a lot of buttons. You can push the button and we'll talk for an hour or two on a host of different topics. But what we'd really like to do is hear from you, address some of your questions. So if somebody would like to ask a question, please do that. You can do them in writing and bring them up, or you can stand up, and we have a microphone over here.
Yeah, please wait for me to bring the microphone because this is being webcasted.
I'd like to know, how are you going to intervene in the quid pro quo in terms of federal funding and also private prisons relevant to the enticement of local authorities relevant to this? Because a lot of them, like Bedford and other, they've received federal funding or stipends amongst having through the deportation process. Also, there is in particular areas where, like in eastern Lake County, Paynesville, and other areas, or south of here in Seminole Portage, there is local law enforcement doing that. So, in terms of also, there's been the threat of withholding federal funds from local law enforcement for that. Also, the stop and detaining, although it is arduous, is that an arduous process, and what happens in the pre-trial detention process?
So there's 2 or 3 questions embedded in that. One of them has to do with the fact that in addition to the private prisons that are very heavily subsidized by the DHS to the tune of 34,000 beds per day, a lot of the law enforcement agencies in Ohio, particularly Seneca County, Jaga County, Morrow County, and Butler County, derive huge amounts of revenue for housing immigration detainees, and therefore may have a, you seem to be suggesting you might have a financial motive for seeing a lot of detentions. And then the second issue, of course, is the threat of withdrawal of federal funding from cities that do not participate with DHS as fully as DHS would like. Would anybody here like to address?
The other question was, you said you had litigated about law enforcement detaining or warrant under the threat of exigent circumstances and the detaining. If they are detained, what happens in the pre-trial detention process in terms of this immigration while you're litigating this? Because pre-trial detention, you lose your job, you lose your home, and so forth. And while you're litigating, litigation is protracted.
Well, and the third question is, where you do have an illegal arrest, you know, what can you do to prevent disaster to the individual? Let me quickly address that one, and I'm going to turn those other 2 larger questions over to my fellow panelists. One of the biggest issues you have is local law enforcement, if they do arrest people unlawfully, the immigrant has very, very little that they can do. They are typically immediately detained. They don't have a lot of money to fight a battle. And the process going through immigration court is extremely slow. So very often a lot of really great cases actually never get litigated at a federal or a circuit court level. And that's an issue.
Can I
Sure.
respond? So I'm glad you brought these questions up because I wanted to talk about who should be detained. That's what your question raises to me, is what type of immigration violation should warrant being housed in a jail facility alongside people that have committed, you know, actual crimes. I know a lot of people, 2 people I'm thinking in particular from Central America who are fighting their deportations right now because they don't want to go back to gang-ridden violence, have been in detention for a year. One is an 18-year-old, now a 19-year-old boy, and one is a woman, and I believe she's still up in Butler right now. Or no, not Butler, I'm sorry. Where is she? Tiffin. Yeah. Yes, exactly. I don't know if I should say, you know the case very well. So what's the taxpayer interest in having people that pose no risk to society detained? There are alternatives. I don't like ankle monitors, but you do see people out with ankle monitors. People who have lawyers more likely to show up for their court cases. So I think we need to take a step back and say, why are all of these people, should we really be detaining all of them? There was another, a news article that came out last week that said kids in detention were getting in trouble because they were taking crayons and drawing on the walls. Why are children in jail? Okay? So yes, so I believe that the gentleman is hitting on the key point, which is the financial driver behind, you know, that the localities are strapped for money and they're not going to want to get rid of jobs and lose that cash cow. And I understand that. I'm from Ohio. I get it. But, I mean, we as a society should be disgusted that we're putting people in jail who've done nothing worse than cross the border to try to feed their family, and who are fighting their cases and have a decent shot at winning. So, and then the other thing, just to mention this too, is to remember that, you know, we talk about, let's detain this person, we've got 34,000 beds, and these people are illegal, this kind of, that, and the other thing. They're here, they're working. Everybody in this room is benefiting from them. You know, I hope you enjoyed Thanksgiving. That turkey was probably harvested by an immigrant. if you eat turkey.
Undocumented one.
Yeah, an undocumented immigrant. So, you know, we're all part of this. And I went to a community vigil in Lorraine last week where immigrants were giving testimonies about how they're afraid. Every one of them got up and talked about the jobs that they do for us. And yet we're getting ready and we're terrorizing them and telling them that, you know, your days here are numbered, and make arrangements for your children who are born here to stay with a relative because you're going to leave. Sorry.
What happens to an undocumented or an illegal alien who actually does commit a crime in the U.S.? Murder, rape, robbery? Do they go through the criminal justice system? And if they're convicted, what happens to them?
Sure, I can take that. Let me just, words are really important, and I just want to be, I don't use the term illegal alien, and I'll tell you why. And not just wanted to point out that I don't use it. It's not legally correct. There's nothing in the statute referring to people who are undocumented as illegal aliens. The statute refers to unauthorized. Unauthorized. Alien is probably fair because it is in the statute, but illegal alien is a pejorative. And it's something that was conjured up by restrictionists to dehumanize these people. So I use the term undocumented, and when I taught class here, I taught immigration law here for the better part of 20 years. I use that term in class as well, or non-citizens, just pointing that out. What happens? Look, everybody in this country is under the law. And contrary to some of the rhetoric that we've heard over a year and a half, undocumented immigrants who commit crimes are prosecuted and do jail time. Period. Done. They don't get released. We have very strict mandatory detention provisions under the law. So if I'll give you a hypothetical example, an immigrant, a long-term permanent resident, who's been here, who's got a family, suppose he's married to a U.S. citizen, he's got U.S. citizen children. So suppose he gets into a bar fight one night. Happens. And you suppose he gets charged with assault and gets convicted, takes a plea bargain, it's his first offense, judge sentences him to a year and suspends the sentence. That's going to be considered probably an aggravated felony under the immigration law. That means that he's looking at automatic deportation. It also means that he's not getting out of jail, even though he never got jail time. U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement will show up at his first probation meeting and will arrest him. So, facts are important. And unfortunately, we've been through a presidential election which has been fact-free. We've got a president of the United States elect who does not understand facts. And the notion that there are scores of undocumented criminals running around this country is just not true. The notion that non-citizens who've been convicted of crimes walk free is just not true. Of course, there are exceptions to every rule, unfortunately. But I deal in this stuff every day. Andy deals in this stuff every day. Lama does and Lynn does, and we see it. People who are convicted of relatively minor crimes are locked up by the system, and it works, and it has worked. And there's Supreme Court cases on this because it's so harsh, it's being litigated.
Clarifying question, please. I didn't understand your hypothetical. I thought you said that this person in your hypothetical was a citizen.
No, I said he was a permanent resident.
So
that's a permanent green card.
Okay, so does that mean he is undocumented?
No, it means he's documented. So documented, anybody who's not a citizen of the United States, the way the regulations were written shortly after 9/11, they can lock up and throw away the key until the Attorney General decides to let them go. It's not that difficult to do.
Even if you have a permanent green card?
Yes.
So thank you for the reminder that we use language and terminology that is often confused. A U.S. citizen is a U.S. citizen. It's somebody who can vote. They can't be deported. They have a right to be in the United States. They might go to jail for a crime, but once they get out, they're still going to be a U.S. citizen. A lawful permanent resident is somebody with a green card, and it's kind of self-explanatory. That is a person who has a lawful right to remain in the United States permanently, so long as they don't do anything bad. And they can have just about any job, and they can travel back in and out of the U.S. There are, in addition, to them, there's, I don't know what the number is, 10, 20 million people who are non-immigrant
different people on temporary visas.
Yeah, people who are on temporary visas who are also lawful. And then there's, between maybe 10 and 12 million people who are in the United States whose visas have expired or who entered the United States without a visa.
The reason I made this person in the hypothetical a green card holder was because I was trying to illustrate that you don't have to be undocumented. You can have a legal status and still be subjected to the very harsh laws that we have in place on immigrants. That's what I was trying to point out. So thanks for the question, because obviously I didn't make that clear. Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
We have a question here.
I suggested maybe time to have a constitutional amendment on immigration, and I'd like to give a couple considerations. My mother was an immigrant, so I get to be thinking about that and look at the Constitution. And there's just so little constitutional foundation for immigration. We talk about why did they say that African slaves should be counted as 3/5 of a human being. And of course, we kind of, are amused by that in a certain way. And then we had the African slave squadron that tried to prevent the illicit importation of African slaves in the 1850s. But then, without a constitutional foundation, we're leaving so much of this to the tender mercies of the new Attorney General and the Supreme Court. And I'm of the mind to think that the Supreme Court is what has been characterized by others as a slow-cycling bipolar personality that's produced decisions. You can read about them in the 1830s that trampled on Indian treaties, that dignified acts of genocide against the American Indians. They came up with Plessy versus Ferguson, and dignified the deportation of certain Japanese aliens and the concentration of them. So it seems to me that with respect to immigration, we're giving so much of this over to the wild value judgments of what's soon going to be a changing Supreme Court. Why give them that latitude? Why not have a constitutional convention and let the people decide and let learned lawyers say, this is what our policy should be. Here's how we're going to protect political refugees. Here's what we're going to do for other people. Why haven't we thought of this?
I personally would be afraid that in this current climate, the people who want to end the 14th Amendment's birthright citizenship might actually, after Trump's election, I worry about some possible extreme results of that. But it's an interesting idea. Other panelists?
Yeah, I used to teach immigration law, and I remember, teaching that there is no constitution, there's very little constitutional basis for who regulates immigration. There's the naturalization power. There's some other provisions that the Supreme Court has kind of wielded together. But, you may or may not be right. I honestly haven't thought about it all that much over the years. I think I'm more focused on what do we do now, because we have a dysfunctional system. And I could go on and on about why it's dysfunctional. You do have 11 million people in this country undocumented. That's not the problem. That's a symptom of the problem. The problem is a system that was built roughly statutorily in the 60s to govern a country, to regulate immigration in the 1960s. Okay, so in those days, if you had a hardware store, your biggest competition was the hardware store across the street. Nowadays, if you have a business, your biggest competition is probably in Paris or in London or in, South America somewhere. We have a global economy. We don't have an immigration system. We haven't talked about business immigration, which is just as dysfunctional and doesn't meet the economic needs of this country, doesn't create jobs, doesn't bring in investment, doesn't reward, people who are creating jobs. I have to fight like the Dickens for brilliant scientists to get green cards in this country. So we do need a revamping. I don't think we need to go back to the Constitution. I think I feel more comfortable revamping the law, but under the current administration, I just don't have any hope that they're going to want to do anything other than, give red meat to the base and give some harsh enforcement laws that we don't really, at this point, need.
Yeah, I'm actually glad you mentioned birthright citizenship. I was going to ask you, do you think there's a chance that they would actually revoke that? And secondly, I guess in terms of prosecutorial discretion, there's a lot of talk about people on DACA. Did they just give the government the information to deport them? And what about the people that already got prosecutorial discretion? Does that mean that, your time's up after, what's going to happen to our clients, basically?
Let me ask Lynn to address the second part of that.
Oh, my God. So in terms of what's going to happen to folks that have DACA that gave their information over to the government. There's a lot of smart people right now trying to figure out ways to protect them. And, you know, I'm not being naive, but we are waging a big battle towards Trump to not get rid of DACA. I don't know if we're going to win or not, but it's going to be the first big battle on immigration of the next administration. And, you know, you've got 750,000 people who've been working in their chosen careers, buying homes and getting married and stuff, been sort of living the American dream that they always wanted. And the prospect of that getting taken away from them, I think, is going to bring them back in full force as full advocates for themselves. And then, the second one was people that got discretion other ways. Yeah, I mean, honestly, I'm worried about it. You know, we worked on a lot of cases over the last several years of people that were given exercises of discretion. And the only thing that's changed is that they have 2 more years in this country. And, you know, it's gonna be a test of the Trump administration to see if they, you know, follow similar priorities. And it's also going to be a test of us if we as a community can rally around people. Before it was just sort of like the immigration lawyer and the advocate and then the immigrant community fighting the deportation case. We need all of you.
Right.
If you're a good videographer, if you can do graphic design, if you are great at raising funds for legal services, like we need a whole protection committee to work on a county by county basis to surround immigrants. And if you're interested in that, it's something that we're trying to set up, and see me afterwards. I'd love to get your info and keep you informed about that.
But I think it's important to illustrate what prosecutorial discretion looked like, because it's a legal term, you know, sounds very sterile. You're right. What does it look like? Lynn and I worked on a case a couple years ago involving a man, and on paper, this was something probably Donald Trump would rail against. This was a guy who had entered the country without documents, had been deported, re-entered the country without documents, had been deported, re-entered the country without documents. Okay? He had been charged criminally, and for a variety of reasons, that case was dismissed, and they were about to deport him. Now, I took this case. Lynn and I worked on this case. What I didn't tell you was the reason he kept coming back in was because he was pretty much the sole caretaker of a man who is at that time was about 20 years old, who had severe cerebral palsy and couldn't take care of himself. That the woman he was married to had severe back problems and couldn't take care of her son. And that this was the only man in this guy's life, the ailing young man with cerebral palsy. And that he was also the sole caretaker and provider for this family. So, you know, ICE had to look at that. At that time, you know, there were a lot of other factors, but that's what prosecutorial discretion looks like. That's who it affects. You know, do we deport him? Or do we spend that money and deport somebody who's just... Yes, this man is now in danger. He's in danger of being deported next year.
I can shed some light on what the climate that we're dealing with in the immigration court and ICE in itself. I know someone mentioned about the ankle monitoring. So I have clients, like the rest of us, who are mothers and they have children. And so what ICE has done is said, we'll allow you to be outside of detention, but we're going to slap this ankle monitor on you. And previously, as long as they reported as they were supposed to or obtained a lawyer and went to court a couple times, you can get that ankle monitor off. Right now, I was specifically told by an ICE officer that oversees these issues that they are not removing the ankle monitors. That was as of last week. And unless you can document a medical reason for the removal of the ankle monitoring. As far as prosecutorial discretion for people that are in removal proceedings, what that is just basically we would ask for a client to have their case closed because they're not a priority. We talked about the enforcement priorities, and there's some very meaningful ties in the United States, and they contribute, and they're not criminals. So there would be a decision, and if it's a positive one, their case would be closed. There was a Department of Homeland Security attorney that fears that all those cases are going to come back on the docket that all of a sudden, I mean, there's a lot of craziness going on and a lot of uncertainty, and I think that's what is really the most fearful thing for all of us practitioners and advocates, is that we really don't know what's going to happen. But there's rumors from the people that are in the front lines, meaning a government attorney telling others that, oh, all those cases that you got prosecutorial discretion, they're coming back. They're going to all be opened. All those ankle monitors, they're going to stay on unless you get us proof. Wow, what a waste of money. And wow, what a waste of the lack of efficiency in our court, especially in Cleveland, is horrendous. When we go to court and we get hearing dates, you know, it's unbelievable, because sometimes I have to say, I'm going to knock on wood, I'm going to be around for this case, because they're not scheduling them until 2019. Imagine going to court and the judge telling you, we're going to have your trial, the equivalent of a trial, in 2019. Or 2020. Does that boggle your mind? And now, not only are we going to do that, but we're going to just cancel all these prosecutorial discretions, reopen these cases. What's that going to do to our court system? It wouldn't make sense. It's not efficient. It doesn't make money sense. There's not enough human power for the government attorneys. They're going to just die. That's just too much work. So there's a lot of things that just don't make sense as it is. And it's broken immigration system. Boy, what a phrase, because it's replete, and it's not just with the institutions that give benefits. It's also with the immigration courts. So that's another aspect to look at.
Final question?
Since you haven't really talked much on the issue of refugee resettlement, I was just curious to get your thoughts on what you expect to see in the next 4 years, particularly because we're already well within fiscal year 2017 of resettling refugees in this country. So how quickly do you think Trump will act on changing that ceiling that's set right now at about 110,000, I believe? And how low do you think those numbers will actually get under his administration?
So very quickly, for some of the folks out here who are not as familiar with the refugee resettlement program, the U.S. each year, as every country who subscribes to the treaty does, is agrees, gives the UNH High Commissioner on Refugees a number of refugees that we will accept each year. In the past, that's been, you know, roughly between 50 and 110,000. And so I think the question is, what might happen under Trump? Will the U.S. stop taking people entirely? When might we see that? What are the possible ramifications to the refugee resettlement program of a Trump presidency?
Well, if you take him at his word, which that's all we can do right now. I don't know if we can do that, but
Yeah.
you know, if we take this man at his word, then you know he can stop. He can shut this down. He's talked about, you know, go back if you want to read a speech that's absolutely chilling. Go back and read the speech that he gave in Phoenix, Arizona, in the end of August. I believe it was the end of August. That was the day when he went down to Mexico and then he came back. That speech talks not only about, you know, the pretty much telegraphs that he would shut down refugees, particularly Syrian refugees, which really need help, other refugees, that he wants to close that door. He wants to do what he calls extreme vetting, which he hasn't really defined. And then he also pretty much said in that speech that he wants to take legal immigration to historical lows. So the question then becomes, you know, what will he do? I don't know. I honestly, I don't know. I have to take him at his word. So that means we're going to be looking at Syrian refugees who are, you know, being cut out, other refugees being cut out, Central American, like Lynn pointed out, the flow from Central America where kids are fleeing horrific violence, being shut down, much more. So who knows? I mean, that's why, you know, Lynn's plea to all of you, people in this room are the difference between that kind of country and what America is supposed to be like. And I think more than ever before, at least in my lifetime, we're in a situation where each one of us in our communities, the integrity of the immigration system, the integrity of the country, in fact, depends on everybody in this room and your neighbors. And I don't mean that as some, you know, I'm very serious about it. My father is a I come to this because my father, I think, my worldview, my father is a Holocaust survivor. And, you know, this is not Germany in 1933. I'm not going to go there. But Lynn pointed out hatred is becoming commonplace. Nazi swastikas or hate crimes and so on. Our job is not to normalize this. Our job is my view. Our job is to make sure that we hold our country.
As Lynn mentioned, we'll be here afterwards if any of you have any questions or if you want to talk to Lynn about getting tapped into some of the local efforts. Thank you for coming today.